All right, let's do this. Today, we are diving deep into fluent English. You know,
Sounds good.
we've got this really cool episode of Speak English Fluently to unpack.
Awesome.
So much good stuff in there, tons of tips and tricks. And I know, you might be thinking, fluency, I just want to
Yeah.
be able to order my coffee, without having a panic attack.
Right.
But the cool thing is,
Yeah.
this podcast gives us advice that you can actually use right away,
Mm-hmm.
even if you aren't trying to, be some kind of Shakespeare.
That's a great point. Fluency, it's not about being perfect.
Right.
It's more about expressing yourself clearly and confidently.
Yeah.
And just having that smooth flow when you're communicating.
Yeah.
Even if you maybe mess up a word or two here or there.
Yeah.
Just like a jazz musician.
Right.
They might improvise a note or two,
Yeah.
but they're still keeping that rhythm going.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Yeah.
And speaking of rhythm,
Right.
this podcast uses a fun little role play. It's between a student and a teacher,
Mm-hmm.
and it's demonstrating their tips,
Okay.
which I think will be really helpful for us to understand it all.
Absolutely. I think role plays are such a good way to
Right.
really bring those concepts to life,
Yeah.
It's one thing to hear a tip,
Right.
but it's another to actually see it being applied
Right.
in a situation that you can relate to.
Exactly.
It just makes it so much more memorable.
So let's just jump right in.
Right.
One of the first things that I noticed was this idea of thinking in English.
Okay.
And they even suggest narrating your daily routine in English.
Okay.
So have you ever tried that?
It's actually a technique that has some neuroscience behind it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, when you consistently use a language, even when you're just thinking to yourself,
Yeah.
in your internal monologue,
Mm.
you're actually strengthening the neural pathways that are associated with that language.
Wow.
So it's kind of like you're building a mental muscle
Yeah.
to make it easier to recall words and to form sentences spontaneously.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
So it's not just some random advice.
Right.
There's actual science behind it.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder,
Yeah.
what would it actually be like to think aloud in English throughout the day?
Mm.
Imagine,
Yeah.
getting ready for work,
Right.
making breakfast,
Mm-hmm.
and you're just narrating everything in English.
That'd be kind of a fun challenge.
Right.
Yeah. It's a great way to immerse yourself in the language.
Yeah.
Even when you're not sitting down to study.
Yeah.
It's just about creating that constant exposure
Right.
and really integrating English into your everyday life.
Yeah.
And who knows, you might even find yourself thinking in English without even realizing it after a while.
No, that would be a win.
Yeah.
Another tip that they shared that I really was really interested in was shadowing.
Okay.
So this is basically
Oh, man.
mimicking native speakers, from this podcast that we're listening to,
Right.
from a TV show, anything
Mm.
to try to improve your pronunciation and sound more natural.
Shadowing is such an effective technique.
Yeah.
And it's not really about mimicking perfectly.
Right.
It's more about internalizing that rhythm,
Yeah.
the intonation,
Mm-hmm.
and the way that native speakers naturally kind of group words together.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like learning to dance
Okay.
by watching a professional dancer.
Yeah.
You're observing their movements, their flow.
Yeah.
And then you gradually try to incorporate those elements
Yeah.
into your own style.
That's a much better image than, vocal coach in your pocket.
Right.
I can see myself now,
Yeah.
on the dance floor,
Yeah.
grooving to the rhythm of English.
There you go.
And one thing I thought was interesting in this podcast was
Yeah.
they were really emphasizing learning phrases
Okay.
instead of just individual words, right?
Right.
And they made a really good point about how it's more efficient to learn phrases.
Yeah.
Good job. That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Instead of just memorizing words in isolation.
And the reason why that works so well is because it reduces cognitive load.
Oh.
So when you have a bunch of phrases that are ready to go,
Yeah. Yeah.
you don't have to use as much mental energy
Right.
to search for the right words when you're having a conversation.
Mm.
You can just focus more on the message you're trying to get across.
It's like having pre-assembled building blocks for communication.
Exactly.
You can just snap them together to
Right.
create, more complex expressions.
Exactly. And speaking of building blocks,
Yeah.
I think it's time that we dive into that role play that they used
Okay, yeah.
to demonstrate these techniques.
Mm,
So remember, they had Clara playing the student who was struggling with fluency,
right.
and then James was the teacher offering guidance.
Okay, so let's see how these tips actually come to life
Yeah.
in this little scenario. I'm curious
Yeah.
how they handle some of those,
Right.
common challenges that we all face.
Exactly.
Yeah, that there's some good stuff there.
I think you'll find it pretty relatable.
Yeah.
It really highlights how even those who are feeling kind of stuck with their fluency can actually take action
Yeah.
using these simple but really powerful techniques.
Awesome.
So in this role play, they have James suggesting that Clara drinking in English throughout the day.
Okay.
Like he's encouraging her to narrate her actions.
Right.
Even just little things like making breakfast, getting dressed.
Yeah, I bet that takes some getting used to.
Right?
Was she resistant at all to that idea?
It's surprising. She was actually really open to it.
Oh, cool.
She realized that she wouldn't have to
Yeah.
take extra time out of her day
Right.
to do this. It was more about just
Yeah.
shifting her mindset, creating that constant internal dialogue in English.
It's a sneaky way to get extra practice in. Yeah, totally.
Like a mental boot camp for your English skills.
Exactly.
I like it. Did they address at all kind of those,
Yeah.
anxieties that language learners often face?
Right.
I'm thinking specifically about,
Yeah.
the fear of making mistakes.
Absolutely. James actually brings that up.
Okay.
And he kind of reframes mistakes as valuable feedback.
Okay.
Like, they're not setbacks.
Right.
They're opportunities to learn and to grow.
Right.
So it's
Yeah.
all about embracing those imperfections as part of the process.
It's so easy to get caught up
Right.
in trying to be perfect.
Yeah. For sure.
With your pronunciation and your grammar.
Right. Right.
But I guess fluency is more about the overall flow and your ability to communicate.
Exactly. And James even touched upon the
Yeah.
concept of speaking too fast,
Okay.
which can actually be another obstacle to fluency.
Interesting.
So he advised Clara to slow down,
Right.
take a breath, and actually think before speaking.
It's better to just,
Yeah.
pause for a moment
Right.
than to just rush through a sentence and lose your listener.
Totally. I think we've all been there where we're just
Oh, yeah.
trying to cram in as many words as possible, and we end up just sounding like a mess.
Exactly.
Did James offer any tips
Yeah.
for those times when you just can't seem to find the right word?
He did. He suggested paraphrasing,
Okay.
which is a fantastic strategy to
Yeah.
keep the conversation going
Right.
without getting stuck
Yeah.
searching for vocabulary.
Right. You just got to keep it moving.
Exactly. Sometimes it's better to just use simpler language that you're comfortable with
Right.
than to get hung up on trying to remember that perfect word.
That's a great reminder
Yeah,
to be kind to ourselves,
absolutely.
during this whole process.
For sure.
So beyond these core techniques that we've talked about,
Yeah.
did they offer any other
Mhm.
resources or tips for language learners?
They did. James and Clara emphasized the importance
Oh, okay.
of creating opportunities for practice,
Okay.
such as joining conversation groups or reading aloud.
Those are both fantastic.
Yeah.
I've heard really great things about conversation groups.
Yeah, it's like a safe space
Yeah.
to experiment, to make mistakes,
Yeah.
connect with other people who are on the same journey.
Also like a support group,
Yeah, exactly.
but for language enthusiasts.
I love that.
I think I might steal that.
Go for it.
And they also encourage listeners to really immerse themselves in
Man.
English media,
Yeah.
like podcasts,
Yeah.
movies,
Yeah.
TV shows.
Absolutely.
It's that passive but powerful way to
Wow.
really absorb the language.
Yeah.
Pick up new vocabulary and expressions,
Right.
get a feel for those natural speech patterns.
We're like creating this little mini English-speaking world around yourself.
Yeah, I love that.
Even if you're not physically in an English-speaking country.
Totally.
Yeah.
And speaking of motivation, did the podcast touch upon
Mhm.
celebrating progress along the way?
They did. They highlighted how important it is to acknowledge those little victories.
Yeah.
No matter how small they might seem.
Right.
Each step forward, even a tiny one,
Yeah.
it's progress.
Right.
And it's worth celebrating.
Yeah.
Fluency is a journey, not a destination.
And like any good journey,
Right.
it's full of detours and unexpected discoveries.
Mm.
And those moments of pure joy
Yes.
when you finally master something.
Absolutely. And one thing that really resonated with me was
Yeah.
their discussion about the link between confidence and fluency.
Right. Yeah.
They were emphasizing that.
Yeah.
The more confident you feel,
Hmm.
the more likely you are to speak smoothly and naturally.
Right.
It's like this positive feedback loop.
It makes so much sense.
Yeah.
If you're constantly second guessing yourself,
Right.
worried about making mistakes,
Yeah.
that's going to affect your flow.
Absolutely. So did they suggest any ways to specifically boost confidence?
I'm glad you asked.
Okay, great.
They really encourage listeners to focus on their strengths, acknowledge their progress,
Yeah,
and celebrate their successes, no matter how small.
right.
It's about like shifting your mindset from
Yeah,
focusing on what you're not good at
right.
to appreciating how far you've come.
I love that.
And I imagine having a supportive environment also plays a big role.
Absolutely. Having that positive and encouraging atmosphere
Yeah,
can make a world of difference.
totally.
It helps you feel more comfortable taking risks, making those mistakes,
Right.
and ultimately just growing as a speaker.
So surrounding yourself with people who uplift and encourage you,
Yeah,
that's key.
absolutely.
Do they have any suggestions for where to find those communities?
They highly recommend joining conversation groups.
Okay.
It's a fantastic way to actually put all of these fluency tips into practice
Yeah.
in a real-world setting. You get to interact with other learners,
Great.
share your experiences, and build that confidence
Yeah.
in a safe and supportive space.
Plus, you get to make some new friends
Right.
who share your passion for learning English.
Exactly. And they also mention the benefits of reading aloud,
Okay.
which can be a great way to practice pronunciation
Right.
and to build confidence as well.
Yeah.
It's like having a little solo rehearsal before
Yeah.
you perform on stage.
I can see how that would be really helpful.
Right.
You can experiment with different intonations, work on your pacing,
Right.
get comfortable with those sounds
Hmm.
without the pressure of having an audience.
Exactly. And of
Yeah.
course, they reiterate the power of immersing yourself in English media,
Right.
podcasts, movies, TV shows.
Yeah.
All of that contributes to
Yeah.
that subconscious absorption of the language.
It's like creating a soundtrack for your language learning journey.
I love that.
This constant stream of authentic English input
Yes,
that gradually shapes your speaking style.
exactly. So I guess to wrap it all up,
Yeah.
the key to speaking English fluently is this multifaceted approach that involves consistent practice,
Mm-hmm.
a positive mindset, and a willingness to embrace challenges.
It's not about chasing perfection.
Right.
It's about enjoying the journey
Yeah,
of growth and self-discovery.
absolutely. And remember, you don't have to do it alone.
That's a great point.
There are tons of resources out there, from podcasts like the one that we've been discussing,
Yeah.
to conversation groups, language exchange partners, online communities.
It's like having a whole team of cheerleaders
Exactly.
rooting for you every step of the way.
That's a great way to put it.
Now, before we move on, I have a
Absolutely.
question for you, listener.
Right.
Think back to that connection between confidence and fluency.
Mm-hmm.
What's one small thing that you could do today
Yeah.
to just boost your confidence in speaking English,
All right.
even just a tiny bit?
It could be anything from practicing a few phrases in front of the mirror
Mm.
to maybe complimenting yourself on your progress.
Yeah.
Or even just acknowledging your commitment to learning.
Yeah.
The goal is to create that positive momentum,
Right.
to plant that seed of belief in yourself.
I like plant the seed. Yeah. It's like, fake it till you make it, but for languages.
Exactly. And the more you practice, the more that confidence will become genuine.
So to kind of wrap up our deep dive into the world of fluent English, we've uncovered a lot of actionable advice,
We have.
from thinking in English
Right.
and shadowing native speakers
Mhm.
to embracing mistakes
Mhm.
and celebrating those little wins,
Yeah, I think it's really a holistic approach
for sure.
to language learning.
Yeah, we've learned that fluency, it's not about perfection.
Right.
It's about communications and confidence
Yeah.
and the joy of just expressing yourself in another language.
Which is so important.
Yeah, and we've also talked about how important it is to find those supportive communities.
Yeah.
Immerse yourself in the language and, just constantly challenge yourself to grow.
Absolutely. And remember, listener, fluency is a journey, not a destination.
That's right.
So embrace those ups and downs, celebrate every milestone,
Yeah.
and never stop exploring the richness and beauty of the English language.
Well said. I think we have given our listener a great toolkit for their fluency journey.
I agree.
So until next time, happy learning.